Foreign language, non-translatable. For months, President Donald Trump signaled to the global community his assessment that Kiev lacked leverage, emphasizing he inherited this conflict and would have prevented it, reiterating the war should never have occurred under his watch, and indicating Vladimir Putin should have negotiated earlier. The Russian president, emboldened by these statements, intensified pressure on the Ukrainian government to capitulate. However, President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed his strategic hand to both leaders. With maximum force, Moscow itself has now become an active combat zone. The visual shows the Shatura thermal power plant, one of the capital region's most vital energy facilities, neutralized by Ukrainian long-range autonomous strike drones. Civilian footage captured Russian forces attempting aerial intercepts, defending the Shatura installation. Filmed from nearby hotel windows in Shatura, Moscow residents awoke to devastated power infrastructure. The assault continued. A second strike wave targeted the facility at dawn. Zelensky executed his strategic gambit decisively, casting Putin's vision for Moscow into complete darkness. Social media imagery from the morning hours confirmed that Ukrainian autonomous systems demolished the Shatura facility in the Moscow Oblast. During this follow-up assault, the target sits merely 120 kilometers from Kremlin walls. Capital residents awakened that morning, confronted not just by acrid smoke, but by the stark realization of state defensive failures. Standard doctrine involves single-wave attacks before withdrawal. Yet when the second morning strike commenced, Ukrainian forces caught Russian repair teams and emergency responders completely unprepared. This precision strike, penetrating dense Russian air defense networks, fundamentally undermines Vladimir Putin's credibility claims. This operation sends an unmistakable message. Significant offensive capabilities remain available. Meanwhile, where was Putin positioned? Intelligence shows him concealed in a subterranean command bunker. This visual projected nothing of triumphant leadership. Russian citizens perceive this as cornered leader syndrome. The strategic costs of this prolonged conflict that Putin continues losing now extend far beyond frontline military casualties. These costs now penetrate ordinary civilian existence, deep within Russian territory, threatening their winter heating systems. Ukrainian drones targeted more than transformers, with generation capacity reaching 1,500 megawatts. The Shatura thermal power plant serves dual critical functions for electrical generation and thermal heating across the Moscow Oblast. Capital residents now face darkness and cold conditions. Midwinter, the resulting inferno from the strike severely compromised power transmission infrastructure. Linked to the unified energy system industrial networks, metro systems medical facilities, millions of residences halted instantly. Footage of rising smoke columns, flames and disorder spreading across social platforms has severely damaged public confidence in governance. The Russian economy teeters on systemic collapse. Mounting casualties destabilize the population. Internal civil disturbance risks are escalating. Power disruptions will intensify economic deterioration, creating strangling effects on manufacturing and logistics networks. Given the facility's 1,500 megawatt generation capacity, removing this output will devastate operations comprehensively, from heavy industry to daily civilian needs. This destabilized environment directly compromises Vladimir Putin's grip on authority. Yet Putin attempted to project strength by engaging with Washington's 28-point peace framework, adopting a posture suggesting he maintains command. President Trump may perceive Putin's position as formidable from approximately 10,000 kilometers distance. However, Zelensky's targeted strikes against energy infrastructure have exposed critical Russian vulnerabilities. Analysis returns to the day the 28-point framework was released. Ukraine responded immediately with strategic action, deploying its available capabilities. Combat reached deep into Russia from Ryazan toward Moscow, spanning Kursk to Oryol during November 19th through 20th. This represents more than conventional drone warfare. It constitutes a precision strike against Putin's regime. And his victory narrative, the primary objective was Ryazan, hosting Russia's major petroleum refining operations and Moscow's principal fuel supply corridor. This refinery sustained 8 separate strikes throughout the year. The cumulative attacks completely ceased operations. At the Ryazan refinery complex, the critical artery supplying 40% of Moscow's fuel was severed. The capital immediately suspended airport operations due to security threats in the Kursk region. Over 16,000 civilians lost electrical service. A coordinated strike hit the Ryazan thermal power plant during that same night. Analysis now shifts beneath Moscow's surface into those reinforced concrete structures. While Vladimir Putin broadcasts superpower narratives through Russian state media channels, his location is not the Kremlin's ornate chambers. The leader, proclaiming total control to citizens, broadcasts from subterranean facilities with evident tension, wearing military fatigues as Shatura and Ryazan burn. This project's not leadership, but a trapped fugitive image. Why does a superpower's commander conduct critical strategic sessions from underground? as though anticipating imminent missile strikes. The answer is fear. While Zelensky shares tea with frontline troops, Putin conceals himself in his own capital, from his population and Ukrainian aerial systems. This contrast has shattered the strongman mythology. Among the Russian citizenry, Russian citizens now recognize this reality. Their war architect hides meters below ground, in his filtered ventilation safe room. While they endure freezing conditions, this exemplifies bunker mentality syndrome. Historical patterns show when dictators retreat to bunkers, their regime's expiration has already occurred. Putin exhibits panic, confronting Ukraine's extended-range strike capabilities. This fear propagates like contagion through the general staff chain of command. When bunker fear intersects with street-level anger, chaos ensues. Russia's domestic front crumbles faster than incoming missiles. The massive logistics apparatus sustaining Putin's war effort. Russian Railways RZD has effectively capitulated. 700,000 railway personnel. Russia's largest labor force now abandons Putin's cause. Unpaid salaries, parts shortages, and extreme labor conditions have driven this workforce toward quiet insurrection. When railways halt, Russia halts entirely. Russia functions not as a road nation, but as a rail-dependent empire. Siberian coal, Uralom armored vehicles, frontline munitions, all traverse those rail networks. Those networks now deteriorate. This underlies reporting suggesting civil war conditions brewing. Freezing mothers in Moscow suburbs, unemployed refinery workers in Ryazan, and railway workers awaiting overdue wages. For these populations, victory slogans or Donbass mean nothing. Their single reality remains: frozen dwellings, empty provisions, and deceptive leadership. Intelligence leaks from within military ranks now exceed 5% of total force strength. This threshold historically triggers complete morale disintegration. Russian soldiers now prepare to redirect weapons not at Ukraine, but toward their own officers. Amid this turmoil, President Zelensky and Ukrainian military command are executing doctrine that will define modern warfare studies: asymmetric dominance. While Putin assumed Ukraine's options exhausted, Zelensky reshuffled entirely. The conflict has evolved beyond frontline trench engagements. Combat now penetrates Russia's strategic depth across the entire territorial expanse. Ukraine's Palyanitsa missile system, drone hybrids, and extended-range platforms have rendered every point, from Sakhalin Island in Russia's eastern reaches to western Kaliningrad, into viable strike objectives. The Zelensky doctrine's foundation is clear: avoid attritional frontline combat against the enemy. Dismantle the infrastructure, enabling enemy force projection. First, energy neutralization. Blind S-400 systems by destroying power plants feeding radar networks. Second, economic attrition. Collapse currency and exports by targeting refinery capacity. Third, psychological warfare. Strike Moscow to demolish invincibility narratives. When Zelensky enters negotiations, his leverage extends beyond territorial demands. He possesses capability to comprehensively disable Russian energy systems. Putin fails to comprehend this reality. Ukraine no longer operates defensively. Ukraine actively targets Russian state-critical infrastructure. The predator has become prey. What haunts Putin in that bunker extends beyond Ukrainian ordnance. His true terror is that recurring historical pattern embedded in Russian national memory. Russian history demonstrates one consistent principle: the Russian populace exhibits extreme patience. Indeed, but when patience fractures, the resulting force manifests not as protest but as volcanic upheaval. Russia's collective memory carries the specters of 1917. Tsar Nicholas II, mirroring Putin, resided in his palace, convinced he managed a brief, triumphant frontier campaign. Yet when women began demanding bread in St. Petersburg streets, the Tsar's massive military, security forces, and intelligence services disintegrated. The reason is clear: hunger and cold always defeat patriotic messaging. Current Russian conditions represent a conflict between propaganda and basic sustenance. Basic sustenance always prevails. Present circumstances mirror a dangerous fusion of 1917 and 1991. Throughout history, Russians have rebelled against two conditions: humiliation and futile military campaigns, as occurred against Japan in 1905, Germany in 1917, and Afghanistan in 1989. Current events against Ukraine constitute a superpower's humiliation by its smaller neighbor. This inflicts permanent damage to Russian national pride. State failure to provide essential services. Residences freezing in central Moscow. Dairy and eggs vanishing from markets. These basic shortages historically ignite peaking, or will ignite revolutionary movements. When Moscow transforms into a combat zone, Great Russia propaganda disintegrates. At that threshold, fear converts into unrestrained fury. Putin's critical error is perceiving Russians as infinitely compliant subjects, when civilians lose everything to lose. Even reinforced bunker doors become paper barriers. Russia's moment of reckoning is scheduled. Its countdown now resonates through Kremlin corridors. This represents regime terminal phase. Putin's tactical frontline deterioration compounds with massive strategic defeats sustained in diplomatic channels. Kremlin strategists anticipated Trump's election would fragment the Western alliance. Instead, the reverse materialized. Europe has activated the dormant power awakened. President Trump may perceive Putin's hand as formidable from approximately 10,000 kilometers away, yet European capitals have analyzed Russia and identified one condition: systemic multi-organ failure. Russia now occupies a fully cornered position. The reason? The myth of sustainable conflict has collapsed completely. Russian citizens are exhausted with governance that cannot conceal the staggering casualty figures. Every coffin returning from combat zones transforms suppressed societal anger into explosive potential. Economic analysis indicates Russia cannot sustain through 2026. Under current wartime economics, combined inflation and workforce deficits are driving the nation toward actual civil conflict. Potential mobilization of 700,000 railway personnel signals Russia's logistical arteries are compromised. Here lies Putin's strategic miscalculation. He seeks this agreement not as victory trophy, but as regime survival mechanism. By retaining occupied territories, he attempts to suppress domestic nationalist fury and claim the sacrifices were justified. However, Europe and Ukraine perceive this calculation clearly. They recognize that if Putin exits negotiations now, he lacks capacity to return with equivalent military strength. Therefore, Putin's demand to freeze current positions actually constitutes a disguised admission of defeat. From Europe's perspective, the assessment is clear. Putin's position is weak, his forces depleted, and his population at collapse threshold. Under these conditions, territorial concessions would be morally unconscionable and strategically catastrophic. Putin seeks an exit disguised with victory symbolism. However, Europe remains committed to denying that exit. Why does Washington promote agreement while Kiev strikes? Moscow and Berlin and Warsaw advocate military preparedness. A fundamental memory divide separates Atlantic partners, as vast as the ocean itself. For Washington, the Cold War remained theoretical. For Europe, Russian occupation is lived experience. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. History has taught Europe one principle: any truce with Moscow merely signals the next occupation's beginning. Putin's expansion timeline confirms. This concern is mathematically validated. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea, 2022 Ukraine. European intelligence assesses that rewarding Putin today positions the Baltic states and Suwalki corridor as 2027 targets. At this juncture, probability of Europe and Ukraine accepting such capitulation terms is zero. European collective memory warns, if Ukraine falls, conflict reaches Berlin's borders. Why does Putin favor Washington's framework from pacifist motives? Absolutely not. Putin stands at precipice edge, desperately preventing collapse. Conflicts spill over into Russian sovereign territory. Setbacks in Kursk and frontline stagnation are destabilizing Kremlin foundations. Yet the critical threat is internal. Casualties now exceed concealment capacity. This reality alarms the Russian populace. Economic restrictions and conflict expenditures have pushed Russia towards civil breakdown. Generals assigning blame internally, elite factional conflicts, and mounting popular discontent substantiate assessments of brewing civil conflict. The conclusion is evident. Vladimir Putin may appear at Washington negotiations as the prevailing party, yet this constitutes modern political history's greatest illusion. Behind Kremlin walls, conditions diverge sharply from propaganda narratives. Domestic front disintegration, leadership in the bunker, and European mobilization are driving Russia towards systematic, multi-organ failure. Putin's demand to freeze current lines represents not peace appeals, but an attempt to acknowledge defeat while stalling. Yet the flames consuming Shatura and the coalition forming in London will deny Putin that respite. As Moscow descends into darkness, one question confronts the Russian people. Is freezing worthwhile for the bunker occupant? Historical patterns indicate the answer is invariably negative. The empire crumbles, and even bunker refuge cannot muffle that approaching reckoning. At PPR Global, we continue monitoring every development in this historic collapse with verified sources and data. Thank you for your viewership.